concrete architecture in the 1920s and the kind of continuous development of the international style, and that's what you wanted to study, and you wanted to see what kind of discussions around nature were embedded within the early appropriations of concrete in international style. So you kind of narrow it down your research. Then I would expect to see a literature review being built around what have academic scholars said about the appropriation of concrete, and what were the constructions or imaginations of nature associated with modernity. So that's kind of, that would be, in that case, your literature review.
Your research program in between.
And what we hope
steps on a theoretical
moved on to is selecting your case study. So
selecting your case
example
study.
I just mentioned, it would be, okay, so which architects are you going to be kind of moving to kind of analyze? So is it going to be Le Corbusier? Is it going to be Alvar Aalto? Is it where are you going to base your study, right? And that allows you, once you select your cases or the object of research, it doesn't need to be many, it can be just one, but in different periods, you know, there are permutations about this. Once you've done that, then that allows you to start thinking about your methodological strategy. So maybe
methodological strategy. Methodological strategy.
So
such a design
that allows you to start thinking, okay, where will I be able to collect my data? How will I be able to collect my data? For some reason, sorry, there's a, I would like to reduce this so people then complain about covering the slide. In a way, in tandem with your literature review development. So basically, how has the literature and academic literature been addressing your topic? What kind of key concepts you're going to be using in your dissertation? So the literature review chapter, just a quick reminder, is the chapter where you also start defining your terms, right? If you're going to use modern imaginations or natural modern imagination, find it and contextualize it. How has it been addressed? Or if you're going to use planetary urbanization, you need to contextualize it within the literature, right? So who has been talking about it? Right? So can people mute themselves? I can hear some voices. So can people mute themselves? Thank you. And what it is important to remember at this stage is that this is not a linear or a straightforward kind of trajectory of the dissertation. You go back and forth and symbol there. So you're going to have to rework your literature review in many ways, and you also will adjust your methodological strategy accordingly. So actually, look, I selected these case studies, but I couldn't have access to the sources. I couldn't find them. So, can Moshina Lee please mute himself? Sorry. I'm hearing voices, so sorry.
Many details, right? And how it applies for context or
There's someone talking, please. Moshina Lee, is it? I'm gonna basically try to mute him myself if I can. Sorry about this. Right. Okay. Seems to be quiet now. Thank you. So once you've selected your methodological strategy and you've and with that, I mean, again, is the alignment of the conceptual apparatus that you're going to be using and how you're going to collect the data, right? So they need to be aligned. So I can't imagine that I will be doing research on modernist architecture, but not think about how am I going to access the sources, right? They need to be aligned and reworked in a way. What starts to emerge is, even on a tentative level, is a series of arguments in relation to how you're thinking about responding to your set of questions. And the argument, when we talk about an argument in a dissertation, is not a simple collection of facts or data or your opinion. it's a substantiated and in a way supported set of responses to your questions, and that support comes from the data and the analysis of the data, right? So the argument of the dissertation doesn't happen once and for all. So in a way, it builds throughout your dissertation process. But it's really important that you understand that the arguments have to be supported with evidence, right? And they seek to actually respond to your research question. So an overall argument in the example that I mentioned could be, well, there's a construction of concrete allowed for the projection of a pristine and pure configuration of natural environments, for example. So this idea that I'm going to try to argue that that concrete allowed for a certain projection of nature, right? So that would be my argument. But in order to sustain that throughout the dissertation, I need to find a collection of sources that allows me to sustain that claim, right? This is a very fragile little logical box. So it might be that you start with a set of arguments. Some people have very strong opinions about what the key argument is at the beginning, but even because they don't have the data yet, those arguments are tentative and they might have to change or be revised, sometimes substantially, as your dissertation progresses. But it's important to have it in mind, because that idea of what do you think from reading relevant literature is actually happening with your problem of research allows you to start thinking about the methods you might need to use, the type of literatures you might want to read. Of course, you would have heard inductive strategies of research where people say, no, grounded theory, for example. I'm going to basically try not to preempt any form of argument in advance, and I'm going to let my sources speak in a way to build that argument. There's debate as to how much you can do that, in the sense that you're never going to the field in a blank state, right? There's a reason why you selected an object of research to observe in the first place. So there's always a hint of an argument or an idea building there. So when we talk about the execution of your dissertation, you've got, which is what you're doing at the moment, is you're building your literature review, and from that kind of draft set of notes that you've been writing so far, you would have more tentative arguments and claims in relation to the overall object of research or key concerns. And sorry, thanks for muting yourself. And so what happens after you kind of develop your tentative claims emerging from your literature, that you are able now to ground your case studies or your object of research. And that's what appears here in yellow. So you start basically tracing and contextualizing your object of research. So now you move from talking in abstract terms about your object of research and your set of processes here that you're studying, planetary urbanization, modernist architecture, whatever it is that you're doing research on, into an actual context or case study or selection of case studies, right? And that is really important. So this is what you should be thinking about now, basically. So, okay, so I got a problem of research. I've got a set of questions that I would like to ask in relation to that problem of research. And I now selected a case study or a set of objects of research or places or practices or architects that I'm going to look at to explore that problem of research. And what you start doing immediately is you start contextualizing and tracing key information and data in association with your object of research before you deploy your methods. And then what we're going to talk later on, before I say a little bit more about tracing and the methods, is you're going to move to analysis. So what do I mean by tracing and contextualizing your case studies? There will be, I think, inevitably a sort of introduction in your dissertation. So let's move back a little bit. So your dissertation will have a general introduction chapter. That will be chapter 1. That will come after the abstract of your thesis and your table of contents. Chapter 2 traditionally is reserved for the methodology chapter, for the conceptual chapter, the literature review chapter. Chapter 3 is for the methodology, if you have one. Otherwise, your methodology would have moved to the introduction. And chapter 4, in this generic template, will start to introduce your empirical section or your case studies. And normally, the introduction to your cases, right? You set the scene for the object of research that you're doing, that you're going to be exploring, whether it's 1, whether it's 2. There are ways that you can modify this, right? Maybe you say, no, I'm going to have a short introduction for each of the empirical chapters. That's fine. But all of those empirical chapters, and by empirical, I mean that those are the objects of research that you're going to be studying, right? They are the sources where your data is going to come from, right? And that could be historical, that could be theoretical, in the sense that you're going to look with architectural theoreticians. That's still a case if you're going to use them as case studies. So you basically introduce when you do the tracing, you can look at, okay, how do I situate that city, that architect, that practice in a historical context, in the city that they are operating, within wider processes. You look at general data, you can look at key policies that are essential to understand your case study. So for example, I'm thinking out loud, but if your dissertation was on social urbanism in Medellin, that chapter and that tracing and that contextualization would require you to situate the Medellin model in its context, right? So why did it emerge? When did it happen? What were the key actors involved? What was happening before? Why was it important? Sorry. Why? There's something going on in the chat. Let me see. Struggling to hear the lecture. Let me see. Trying to see if I can find it function for mute all, but I can't seem to do it. I know it's there, but I can't find it. Well, I'll carry on, and then if we take a break, I'll try to sort that one out. I apologize. Right. So that chapter 4, as I was mentioning, is in a way an attempt to situate your case studies or object of research in historical, geographical context, right? So, and you can use a plurality of sources to do that. Depending on your case study, you would need to look at, what was happening around that practice, around that set of architects, or around that city that made it important, the policies, and sometimes it can be supported by general and available data. It can be quantitative data, census data, if you want to project. So if you were looking at, for example, the emergence of certain community-led housing projects, the contextualization of that could be, well, what led to a housing crisis in that area? And for that, in order to trace and contextualize your case, you would say, well, look, these were the numbers about people struggling to pay the rent, etc. Right? So you can work with general data that introduces your case and contextualizes your case. And that leads then to the kind of core of your empirical material for your dissertation. That will be chapter 5, 6, 7, depending how you organize that section of your dissertation. That will change accordingly, where each chapter will be supported and underpinned by a set of methodological strategies. The list that I just put there is very reduced. Some of you will not use any of those methods. Some of you will use some of you will use a combination of them. It's not a prescriptive list in any means, but just to give you an idea, some of you will use interviews to support one or all of the empirical chapters. Some of you will combine interviews with archival research. So you combine, so let's say you were looking at the emergence of certain environmental concerns in architectural schools in the 1970s, and that's kind of broadly your topic of research for your dissertation. Then one can see that you're going to be combining methods. So for example, you'll be looking at the archives of several schools or one school, and then you could potentially interview some of the former students, now professionals, to combine and triangulate the sources, right? You can, in addition to that, you can work through several layers. You can do material analysis. So if you were working with certain buildings, but also if you were working with objects, if you were working with drawings or plans, videos, films, you can deploy different types of material analysis. So what type of architectures are we looking at, right? Some of you would have a critical view of the material analysis. So in a sense, you're not just interested in what is being presented, but also the journeys of those materials. So whether they come from, how were they produced? Some of you are probably thinking about an urban political ecology, for example, framework. So when you look at materials, it's at the heart of your research, and you might be looking at histories of cement, sand, gravel, and that's absolutely fine. Some of you will rely heavily on accounts of user experience. So they will not just be necessarily or exclusively interviews, but they could be surveys, questionnaires, closed questionnaires. So you give a set of 10 questions, and people need to express in a Likert scale from 1 to 5 how they feel, what they experience, but in quantitative terms, for example. Or you might want to actually reflect that user experience not so much through verbal accounts, but by asking your participants to draw, because maybe you're looking at everyday movements through certain areas that you want to project forms of fragmentation or isolation in certain neighborhoods, and you basically ask your participants to draw how they move, right? So, but in a way, those maps will become your empirical material. Those maps will be sources, right? So, and that relies on, you're deploying a method. When you're asking them to draw a map, that's a method, right? Some of you will be running simulations. Some of you will be working through forms of parametric architecture. Some of you will be looking at how the alteration of certain variables entails or projects certain issues about density or occupation, for example, or shadow, whatever, right? But then simulation becomes a method, right? Some of you will be much more interested in saying, look, I think what I would like to study is how certain policy changes impacted, for example, the production of social housing in the UK or in certain countries in Europe. Okay, so then at the heart of your empirical chapters, there will be policy analysis, right? So, and that's a method, right? So when you work with policy, you basically not just read the policy, but understand where the policy comes from, the different variations, you compare it to previous versions, you understand what are the key terms, what were the implications, and you basically use your even conceptual analysis to anticipate how you will analyze some policy variations, right? It can even be things related to building or infrastructure analysis. Something a bit more, you can rely on BIM, but you can rely on different forms of observation to collate that data. What is important for all of them is things I'm sure you've discussed before, but it's how systematic you are in deploying these methods. What do I mean by this? So the dissertation will start to suffer, the validity of your claims will start to suffer, and the reliability of your claims in a way, or your sources will start to suffer if you basically are erratic in the way you deploy your methods. So for example, if you are trying to collate and analyze the material stemming from your interviews, but it becomes very clear that you've asked very different set of participants that are speaking from radically different points of view, and you are assuming that they are speaking from the same point of view, that's problematic, for example, unless you need them to be different. But sometimes you assume that they have to be central architectural figures, but in a way they're not, so then that's problematic. If the questionnaire is not the same and you're trying to collate the information, if your questionnaires were incomplete, right? If you, for some architects, you manage to do archival research, but for others you don't, but you still make the general claim. So there has to be a regularity in the way you deploy your methods in order to sustain the type of claims you want to associate with the sources you collected. Let me dig deeper a little bit into that. Now you should be entering the stage. This is schematic, right? Some of you would have done it really early on. Some of you are not so sure yet, but most of you should be entering into a data gathering stage from now until February, roughly speaking, right? I mean, some of you will extend a little bit more. You will still be collecting data until March. That's fine because you'll be doing writing at the same time. That, this is an idea, a general template. And when you collect data, you inevitably deploy the methods that I just mentioned. And what you're looking for is how reliable that source is and how valid, in the sense, how well you can articulate the information that you get from the deployment of those methods in relation to the questions you need to answer, and what kind of claims you can get. This becomes really important because, in a way, remember that I hinted that there's a recurrent process going on here, that even though I'm presenting in a linear fashion, your dissertation is a moving logical box until it clicks at the very end. Because it might be that once you thought of a research design, you thought that you would have been able to collect a certain set of sources and data from those sources. But it turns out that what you got is slightly different. And that actually you can't answer exactly the question you wanted, but you can answer something else. And that's absolutely fine. But it's important that you align, right? That you don't keep your impressive, super, wide question of research, and in the end you got, a modest but interesting set of sources and data to support slightly different claims. So there's an issue of alignment between what you set out to do, what you actually did, and what you're getting from your sources in order to sustain and develop your claims. Is there any questions so far? Or people want to jump in and ask something now? You want me to go back? No? Okay. So basically at this stage, what you should try to do is not to think that, oh, okay, from the November to December, I basically worked, or January, I worked on my research, on my literature review. Now that's done. I moved to the data gathering stage, and there's nothing to do with the two chapters. They're actually completely intertwined, right? And so it becomes really important that dimensions that you're studying and starting to appear from your data gathering stage are reflected and supported with your conceptual analysis in the literature review. So there's a circular motion that has to be kind of performed. Now, I will go quickly and then you can stop me and I can give you, hopefully towards the end, I'll try to give real examples of research where where I show you how I deployed the stages, right? And I will rush through them. But so once you start collecting data, it's fundamental that you develop from the very start in order to keep that regularity and systematic deployment of your method, a means of keeping track of your data. Right? It doesn't have to be digital in any way, so it doesn't have to be, software. There are many softwares out there that are prepared to do research. So, for example, in Vivo, Sotero, OneNote is less comprehensive in terms of research, but it can fulfill similar functions. I know from the U of M side that you should have access as a student to most of those packages. Sotero is free, is a plugin. But basically what they do is they allow you to collate sources and annotate them. And Vivo is a bit more comprehensive in the sense that it allows you not only to collect and annotate, and I will introduce the idea of coding, and I will explain what I mean by this in research terms, your references, texts, and things that you've been reading, but it can also help you to annotate your interviews, your audio material, your pictures, your videos, right? So everything is in one place. I'll show you how that looks. Now, if you don't want to do it digitally, which at this stage is probably, it's very difficult if you don't, because it becomes more problematic to search through your sources then. And then the analysis stage, you're kind of losing productivity. And
I think
to be fair, to be frank, really, your time frame is quite tight, right? So you don't have a lot of time. So then, the more time you can save in the analysis stage, the better. So the more kind of, if you rely on digital kind of platforms to do this, I think it can help you to search through your sources. But once you've, let's say everything went really well, which is unlikely because the current conditions and blah, blah, but let's say you had a fantastic research design, that you thought of very creative ways of getting your sources, that the respondents responded, and that your interviews actually took place via Zoom, that you managed to record them, that you managed to take the pictures that you wanted, the videos that you wanted, that you had access to the archives, the policy analysis, or the policies that you will analyze. Everything is in one place. You move on to the analysis stage. Now, also, again, this is not linear. So that doesn't mean that when you're collecting data that you don't stop to actually every night to think about what happened in that interview. I will strongly recommend that you do what's a debrief of your day of research in the afternoon, at night, after you've done anything, taken pictures, collected policies, done interviews. At night, you take your notes and say, look, this interview was important because of this. I think it was really interesting how they use this term. They mentioned this. I found this in the archive. Because things will pile up and then you will struggle to recount your ideas. So that's whilst you are collecting data. When you formally move onto your analysis stage, it's really important that you think of this in the most rigorous of terms. And sometimes one tends to think, and you can see it in writing with students, is that they understand that they needed to collect data, and in a way, the empirical chapters look like they are just literally copying and pasting things that they got from the interviews, some pictures, as if that in itself will substantiate a claim and develop an argument. And that's not quite right. So the analysis stage is what takes fragmented and dissociated data sources, very important, but data points, and makes them coherent in relation to an argument. With this, I mean, you can't have an argument for the chapter and for the overall dissertation if you don't have analysis of your sources. The direct account of an interview per se doesn't provide an argument. You will extract quotes and analyze the quotes, not just in the writing of the text of your dissertation, but before that, in order to start building the argument. So, for example, it's very difficult if the overall claim of your dissertation is that we need to look at certain spatialities of extraction to understand planetary forms of urbanization. Let's say that that's the overall argument of your dissertation, and you want to look at, for example, mining logistical operations as a key form of kind of spatial interventions that expand forms of planetary urbanization. Let's just say that that's the key argument. You're not going to find in an interview someone saying exactly that. It's just not going to happen. But there might be elements in the interview that allow you to build that argument and claim. And you're going to triangulate sources. You're going to use a plurality of sources. But that stems from your analysis, right? Now, in general terms, and I will move quickly through this because, it's just to put it more in context, that normally, and I took away the abduction strategy because it just complicates things epistemologically, but normally, roughly speaking, two generic terms of framing how the analysis works. And one is through an inductive strategy, meaning you let the sources speak in order to develop a conceptual understanding of the processes that you are studying. You don't preempt or confine or try to see whether the sources validate your pre-existing conceptual framework. You basically start building up the terms and concepts through your sources, right? It's an inductive strategy, but it comes from analysis. And again, so for example, the best example is Clifford Gretz when he studied bazaars in different countries in Africa, and he wanted to understand what they meant culturally. And he basically said, I'm going to go in with no preconceptions of, materialist accounts or, Marxist theories. I'm going to basically try to understand what's happening in the mind. And I'm going to see the interactions and understand the interactions to see whether I can then understand patterns and build regularities and understand singularities. And then I'm going to build the argument. A different strategy is what's called a deductive strategy, which is basically, I've got a conceptual framework in mind. So for example, what I mentioned, so look, I think basically to understand contemporary patterns of urbanization, what we need to look at is extractivist spatiality, let's say. And basically what I'm going to try to do with my research is to show how the occurrence and inscription and multiplication or expansion of those spatialities are advancing forms of planetary urbanization. In a way, I'm testing my conceptual framework through the sources, through the empirical analysis. I go, if you want it to use a reference, is top down. Inductive strategy is bottom up. Deductive strategy, top down. This is very schematic. Now, research works in a plurality of ways, and you can have pieces of research which actually sometimes combine those principles, sometimes where the principles are not so rigid. I'm just presenting it for you to understand how you can relate conceptual terms with your sources and how important it is to analyze for either of these strategies, right? Your data will not make sense if you don't analyze, right? That's kind of the takeaway message in a way. And how do we analyze in a way? So what do we do when we do research and we talk about analysis? What is it that we do? It all starts with distilling and effectively transcribing most of the information that we gather. So sometimes a policy document exists in itself, so we don't need to transcribe it. It's there, it's written. Sometimes the interviews need to be transcribed, so they appear in audio material. So I'm going to type them out, and I can analyze them. but basically you create your template of analysis, right? So you basically, and try to introduce regularity. So for example, when you are working with pictures, making sure that there is a principle as to how you took those pictures and where the pictures come from, and what's the collection of those pictures that you're going to be analyzing. So that is a reasoning for the inclusion of that item into the analysis stage, right? So, and so some of the sources might need to literally to be typed out. So there might be a need for transcribing interviews. There might be a need for polishing or transcribing your field notes that you took by hand, or your sketching. Do you want to redo them and collect them in a certain way, or that you want to annotate or cut and organize your audio and video material? Once you do that, there's one way of thinking about your analysis is that what we use indexing or coding, not to be confused with the coding that you probably are most familiar with now, just programming and developing of algorithms. The coding is basically the capacity, your ability from the text or template or source to start building your analysis onto it, and you code. So for example, if I'm reading a policy document and I see, look, this is how they are understanding the importance of infrastructure, and I literally highlight a paragraph and next to it put a code, this is making things up, blue infrastructure, boom. So I know there, this paragraph connects to that term. The term could be just that, a definition, or it could be something a bit more complex. It could be, look, I'm highlighting a process here. So let's say a similar paragraph, but now it reflects, say, gentrification processes after the introduction of certain policy, and I code, right? So I associate that element of the interview, that fragment of the policy analysis, that snippet of 5 seconds in the video to reflect something that I'm interested in relation to my topic of research, my set of questions, my tentative claims, and the key concepts that I'm addressing in the literature review. One hint that is really important is that all the terms that you start dealing with in your literature review chapter, the key concepts, the key conceptual frameworks that you start using in your literature reviews, should start appearing in some way or form, or very directly, as you do your coding of your sources, right? Because that would allow you then to start connecting your different chapters in a way. And the reason why this is really important is that, for example, if we wanted, this allows you to move beyond the pure moment of just slapping quotes or big paragraph of an interview or a simple picture as if the picture will speak for itself. The first level of coding starts to allow you to say, no, hang on a minute, what I'm seeing here reflects a certain process, a certain action. It speaks of a certain change of events that I want to highlight. So that almost allows you to start thinking that your source will need to be analyzed in the text. You just cannot slap a quote and move on. That's bad practice when you write. Right? So when you present a quote, you say, well, what this quote reflects is this. And when you're going to write, basically this of what it reflects, it will be related to the code that you started putting in when you analyze. Does it make sense? I will actually show you how I code inside NVivo. So, bear with me a couple of slides and that will happen. And so you start coding every single source. You code your field notes, your interviews, your pictures, your drawings, your sketches, your videos, your policies, the archival material. When you receive the archival material, whether you managed to take pictures or you had to ask for a digital copy of the sources that you were looking at, you start annotating them. But the annotation is not, it can build through layers, right? It can be a first layer of your first contact with that material. So, oh, look, this is interesting because it speaks of this. And then the second reading of that material is actually, hang on a minute. I think this is clearly reflecting this key process that I wanted to highlight. So now I got a quote. And if you are doing this in digital software like Vivo, you can search through your codes, right? So then it becomes really easy. So hang on a minute, from everything I read or everything I coded in terms of my sources, interviews, videos, blogs, pages, whatever, what did I see that reflected this process? Because this is what I'm writing now in this subsection, in this chapter. And that's almost a good practice of writing. So let me take you back. So if you were writing chapter 5, your first empirical chapter in your empirical section, after you introduce your case studies, and you know that you had to reflect on a certain process in that chapter, you basically, before you start writing, is you print out all your coding associated with the terms that you need to discuss in that subsection for that day. And then you read through them again and say, okay, these two are really good. These are the ones that really will help me. The coding is important because they allow you to start building themes and isolate the variables that you will examine, right? So you cannot do that without the analysis. And this is important because one common mistake, and I know it has to do, a lot of it has to do with time, but some of it has to do with a certain perception of how claims are built. You need to be careful as to what you claim in relation to what you show in terms of a source. So if you show a quote from a single interview, and then you want to extrapolate and make a very grand claim, there's going to be a problem, because even though your quote might hint at that, you actually don't have enough interviews to support that. But if you combine an interview with a picture, a policy document, secondary sources, then suddenly, through that triangulation of sources, your claim is much better supported. And that's really important when you present a claim, is to try to provide a plurality of sources and accounts to support that claim. Now, this sometimes even happens when you're saying that you're analyzing, let's say, the results of a survey that you did. Now, sometimes there are two problems when one presents the analysis of the survey. So the survey, you've got responses from a set of questions that you ask participants, and then you're going to say, now, I codify them, and then now I can do a quantitative analysis. I can extract a qualitative output from my quantitative analysis. Let's say 50% of people or users or respondents do not use this design, part of the building or that part of the building. Okay. But if your survey is based on 5 respondents, you got a problem. You can't claim certain things from just using 5 responses to your survey. Your claim will need to be nuanced in a way, right? Will need to be revised in a way. It's important when you do the analysis and you start coding is that you identify the key variables. So for example, a variable can be something very simple like sex, age, height, but it could be something more problematic or complicated, like class perception or association with a certain movement. So variables can be of different complexity, but at the same time, the analysis starts to help you to develop themes, right? And it's important that you start of this as the building blocks of your dissertation. So in a sense, it is These themes, once you do the analysis, before you start writing and reworking your chapter structure, might allow you to say, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to touch this theme or this set of themes in this chapter, and this one's in the next one because they relate in a certain way. Right? So in a way, you should cross-check what you had as a chapter structure idea as your analysis stage progresses, because you might find that actually, look, from what I've got, I had the idea of doing 3 chapters, but actually I will only be able to do 2. They're going to be better because they're going to be much more robust, but I can't do the 3rd one because the 3rd one is going to be quite thin, right? I don't have enough sources to develop that one, because that theme that I thought I could explore is not emerging through the sources that I'm analyzing. So, as I was saying at the beginning, it is through the kind of escalation and greater complexity of your analysis that the argument is built, that the argument of the thesis is built and developed, right? And in a way, it is through your analysis that you can start building the triangulation of sources to support your claim. This is really important. It's much better to have a smaller, reduced claim that you can definitely support than to make super big, incredible claims with very little sources, right? The former is the better, basically. Just to give you a generic example or an idea of how you can probably work through if you were doing a pure quantitative analysis, which some of you might not be doing, but imagine if you were doing just a pure quantitative analysis and you were trying to explain a phenomenon through the analysis of certain variables. This could be thermal efficiency, this could be density measures, many things. So you work through how variable A impacts variable B in certain ways, and you try to understand the certain conditions and parameters through your code that you apply to your sources, and you look for frequency, you can graph them, and you work through your correlations, right? And that's part of your analysis in a pure quantitative kind of framework. This should say qualitative. This is not right. Anyway, forget about it. The idea here was to actually show the difference between qualitative and qualitative. So in a qualitative description, you will look at not so much trying to explain a phenomenon, but trying to look even from frequency and perception and interpretation, which I think it's here, what is happening, right? As this is part of your analysis. So you work through your code, right? What do you understand, and you assess that it's happening through your sources to look and trace representations, perceptions of your users, practices that might be occurring, etc. Right? The analysis allows you to reconstruct those representations. So, for example, if we go back to the first example I gave you on modernist architecture and ideas of nature, you would try to use your analysis of those archival sources to rework how they represented nature, right? So when you look at, for example, their drawings, their use of the residential gardens, you could trace and start saying, oh, look, this is how they project it. This is how they deal with it. You can combine not just in drawings, but then in the text that they produce. Le Corbusier wrote a lot about nature, for example. So you can use that. Right. So, for example, if you go back to the analysis of a quantitative kind of model, you can perhaps you're going to use different forms of comparison of density through blocks, right? And the way what the analysis will allow you to do is curate, maybe through existing cadastral data, what the different blocks in different kind of urban areas look like, and that you can build your analysis through a comparison kind of strategy, for example. A different qualitative analysis could be, look, I'm looking at this practice in Colombia. It's called Arquitectura Expandida, and they made this community cinema. So what I'm interested in as my overall topic of research is kind of social architecture and participatory methods in architecture. So that was my dissertation topic. And I looked at it in 3 different practices in South America. One of them, for one chapter, is Arquitectura Expandida, this project. And so when I look at the project, I can look at it through the materiality of the project. So basically how the construction process allowed for direct involvement of the community. I can look at the design stage and what participatory methods they use. And I can use that not only through interviews, but also through the records. So the visual materials, so like a picture, and I can do an analysis. I don't know what this line is. I have no idea. Sorry. And it doesn't matter, it's in Spanish, but basically I extracted a paragraph where they talk about their ambitions for the project, for example, and what they thought that those social infrastructures could do for the community. You see, so I triangulated sources, materiality, visual materials for participation, and text description of their projects done by the architectural practice themselves, and I combined them, let's say in this example, in this chapter, right? But that none of these sources by themselves tells me anything. Nothing. So if I slap the picture or the quote without analysis, that it's built on coding and understanding how those sources relate to each other, there's no argument. I can make no claim. Right? Is it clear? Does anybody have a question or concern? Right. I mean, I can take it if you want a 10-minute break, or I can carry on. There's not much left. I wanted to give you an example of an actual research project that I did and show you how I use the collection of data, the connection between the literature review and the sources. But we can break now, or I can carry on. I need a couple of responses, and then I can make a semi-informed decision. If there's nothing against, I'll keep going. Nothing against. Right. 1, 2, 3. I'm going. Right. So let me put this into context through an example. So during the pandemic, I've done a research on the emergence of attempts at instituting municipalist ideas, or kind of, for those of you who are not familiar, kind of rethinking the power of cities to transform political situations. And particularly, I tried to look at how different organizations were trying to address the problems that emerged through the pandemic by creating alternative logistical spatialities and operations. Right. So I was trying to look at how social movements, public agencies try to cope with very different sort of demands for procurement and care through the creation and articulation of different spatial and logistical arrangements. And so that was my topic, let's say. And I had a set of, I managed to delimit a form of research problem. So I was interested in trying to think municipal logistical responses to the pandemic. I was interested in exploring the relationship between municipalism and logistics. And I basically wanted to see if municipalism could be configured as an alternative to what was emerging as a very problematic developments associated with extractivist and logistical urbanizations. That was kind of the starting point. And so I started to develop a literature review. So I read a lot of what were the current debates about logistics and critical logistics. I dug deeper into how what they were saying in relation to how they were that logistical revolution was transforming urban centers and urban settings. And then lastly, I associated it with what's the connection with kind of the most radical responses in terms of counter proposals from at a municipal scale. So then I looked at municipalism debates, right? So that was what I read to organize my literature review, as you had to do. And then I moved on. I had to move on to selecting the case studies. So, where am I going to look at these alternative responses to logistical operations, right? So I was lucky enough to be able to collaborate with local researchers in a city in Rosario in Argentina because I couldn't travel. So we identified, because of my readings, I was able to understand that I had identified a couple of areas. And so we selected 4 different case studies. One was a set of feminist movements in popular settlements that were trying to arrange the logistics of care in a completely different way. Another one had to do with what a political party at a local level was proposing as a counter Amazon. So we looked at that. A third one had to do with something that was very dramatic in Argentina, but in many countries in South America, which is the problem of food distribution during the pandemic. So how we can create alternative food, the logistics of food distribution, and the impact at a municipal level. So we looked at different proposals and groups that were doing different things. And lastly, we looked at how important it was to actually democratize access to knowledge in association to the responses to the pandemic. And so we looked at what the university in Rosario was doing. So those were the 4 cases, right? But what I'm trying to think back. So I did my literature review. The literature review allowed me to isolate and understand that there were possible 4 case studies. And from then I started thinking what methods I could deploy, right? The same way you had to. So imagine this stage was the stage you are in now. So we did, in order to address each of these case studies, we did Zoom interviews because we couldn't do much else. But in order to bypass the problem of contact and getting direct access, we asked them to send us almost WhatsApp, because it's very common in Argentina and available, WhatsApp diaries of what they did that day in relation to the interventions that we were looking at. And some of them collaborated with us. So we used those very small audio snippets as source material. We asked them to send us pictures of their interventions or the drawings about what they were doing. So if they had maps for distribution or timetables or spreadsheets or Google Forms that would allow them to organize their operations. For that was really important, because that would have allowed us to describe the logistical operations that I wanted to reflect on. You see, so that was a crucial material. Some interviews, again, we need it. So examples. We transcribe the interviews. Doesn't matter that you see, because it's all in Spanish. It doesn't matter, but this is, we transcribe the interviews. The first reading of the interviews in that page that you see there allowed us to basically extract the key themes, the key terms that they were using. So, for example, in one of the cases that we were looking at food production, one thing that really caught our attention was that they were using a very specific term of how they will govern those infrastructures of food production. And they were really adamant that they didn't want them to be government run, but they didn't want to be private. So they were running on the idea of gestión social, like social administration. This community organized, led NGO, non-for-profit organization that was public, yet non-government, but it was not private. And for them, that was really important. And for us, when they started describing that in the interview, that was really interesting. And so we highlighted that. We also started to annotate drawings that they had for this kind of food partitioning plant So they developed this. So basically, this was an alternative in trying to rely on very concentrated corporations that were dealing with the fractioning of food, dry sources of food to then distribute into products. They were developing their own fractioning plant in association with local co-ops, but this is the drawing of the plant. So we use this as an idea of what they were trying to do. This is a visual summary of what this counter Amazon model will look like. So Mercado Libre is an established Amazon-like corporation in Argentina, and Mercado Justo was the proposal, and they were basically describing to us in this on a leaflet what were the differences, and we coded and analyzed this set of materials as a key part of our analysis. Another form of analysis, and this is a capture from my in vivo working, the first stages of working through audio material, even before we transcribe, we can code the audio, right? So I would say, okay, in this 5 seconds, there's an issue of counter logistics. Here, logistics and collective action, infrastructures of knowledge, operative units. These are parts of coding, right? This is what I mean by coding, but it means that then I can search through that code and it will give me those 5 seconds when I call it up. So, where can I reflect on if I'm writing about counter logistics in my thesis? Well, everything that I wrote and coded as counter logistics will appear, right? From theoretical sources to empirical material. And so from the analysis stage, we started developing themes, right? And claims for each of the cases. So it was very clear that feminism as an idea was essential to understand the production of care and how feminism was almost creating a distinct form of logistics that was not commodified market-led, but it was structured around the reconfiguration of gender dynamics in the settlements, which is really interesting and important. Then for the counter Amazon model, we looked at how they were calling for the commoning of digital platforms. So they used that as saying that's a territory that we can dispute or put in dialogue with. So we looked at that. And then on the food distribution, themes started to emerge around the specialities of food production. So what is the network and the idea of decommodifying knowledge emerged from the university case study. So forget about the themes here. I don't care about the actual topic. I want you to see how for each of the case studies, this is how we organized it. We started focusing more on each of the case studies to anchor themes for chapters, but we could have organized it differently perhaps by themes and combining the case studies. That's up to you. We chose to actually, because we had to do it really quickly and it's easier potentially, we worked separately in each of these kind of case studies and developed themes and wrote about them. For some, this is basically your empirical section, right? So before this, imagine that in this block here, we've had a context of Rosario and Argentina during the pandemic. So general description of what was happening, what were the key kind of disruptions and policies that were put in place. And then we introduced, our case studies and describe each chapter. Does anybody have any questions? The problem with the methods lecture is that I need to be quite generic because there are 150 topics, so I can't possibly address them. But all of you will have to go through data gathering stage, analysis stage, and argument development stage. That is fundamental, and that you cannot think about the structure of your empirical chapters without analyzing your data. To analyze your data, you need to develop your indexing or coding strategy that will connect with your literature review. So final comment, when we think about this recurrent kind of process, this is not necessarily linear, right? So the analysis will fold you back into your literature review. because you might say, hang on a minute, I was missing, I'm missing support and understanding of this term or this concept. Maybe I need to read further what they said about this, or maybe I don't need this section that I talked about in the literature review because actually I'm not reflecting it so much through my sources, you know. And so I know that you guys are going to be rushed, but it will be good practice to allow yourself some time to actually, even if you've got a good draft now of your literature review, after you write your empirical chapters, that you go back to your literature review and polish it more in accordance to what is it that it's being written in the empirical section. In terms of resources, for some of you who might be looking at something specific in terms of analysis, because, for example, I know that some of you, but maybe not, but some of you might be even doing social network analysis to collect data because of, again, the restrictions that we may be experiencing in terms of accessing interviews. Another good way of accessing data through participants is through social media analysis and social network analysis. And there's a lot in them to how to do it, how to troll Twitter or in a systematic way, so you can basically create some interesting data in terms of networks and user association or theme association in relation to certain topics. So if you've got something more specific or a method that you're not so sure about how to deploy it and you want to read a little bit more about it, perhaps one of the best kind of one-hit resources is Sage Methods. And here's the link. If you can use your University of Manchester account to have access to it, the university is subscribed, so everything is online. And it's an amazing kind of database of methods. So search box, anything that you're interested in, let's say social media analysis, boom, and you got a book or a set of articles. And so I would definitely consider spending a little bit of time when you're writing about your methods to see what's been written on them. This is if you're trying to use something a little bit special, particular picture analysis or video analysis. Again, as I mentioned, social media analysis, simulation, you know, things that are a little bit more out of the ordinary than a simple questionnaire or interview. Definitely consider having a look at. It's also really good if you have problems or doubts about the key terms that I've used or that Stephen used during the lectures of what is research design, what's a question of research, things like that. They got amazing tutorials all embedded in the same website. So it's a good kind of resource to have. Anything else? Is it, oh, let me see, there's a question here. Is it a requirement to include primary sources? No, I mean, we, because of the time frame that you got and because this is a master's dissertation, we are not so adamant about that, but there are definitely, we do encourage you to actually try to navigate the possibility of acquiring some primary sources. So, and we will be quite flexible as to what could constitute as primary sources. So for example, even if you're working with a practice, they most likely have an institutional page. They most likely would have published material. That we can count that as primary sources, even though if you didn't have an interview with them. I hope that helps. Are there any examples for structuring paragraphs in the literature review? Okay. Paragraphs in the literature review. There are definitely in the Sage methods, there will be examples of writing, academic writing, definitely in there. I can share with you additional slides that I gave a lecture on how to craft a literature review to complement what Stephen would have done, and I can post that. They don't get down to the level of paragraph, but they do help in terms of trying to think about strategies. So I talk about how you group sources. So, if you would have read academic articles, you will see that they use a lot of brackets. So what kind of mechanisms you can use to actually start organizing your sources, the references that you're dealing with in the literature review. I can share that. I don't mind. Anyone else? Any other questions? I'll put the slides when I find them, like under session 5 on Moodle. So the slides from today are already there, but I'll add these ones. I know that they don't relate, they go, but I just put it there so everybody can find it. Anything else? And just just to understand the levels of emergency, do most of you feel that you're moving to at least a data gathering stage? Whatever that means, that might be more secondary literature on your cases. I can understand. So, in relation to what Monica was saying, or you're still stuck in the first stage of trying to polish your research design and not much of a response. It's all right. Right. Somewhere in between. I mean, that's okay. That's still time. Still time. And I think probably the sessions that you should have around now and the end of January with your supervisors should start helping towards that kind of data, but it's mixing with my literature review work. It's okay. And I think in a way that's probably normal, in the sense that the more you become familiar with your potential case studies that emerge from designing or thinking about your research, the clearer you become about what you should be reading on. So it's not uncommon. The most difficult thing I think for you guys is that, unfortunately, this is not the only thing you need to do. So you got research methods, you got atelier. So we understand that you are, but you're dealing with this not in an ideal way. So you need to compartmentalize and organize your week. I know that this is probably, this already, but it doesn't always happen. So it's difficult, but I would strongly recommend that you at least manage to allocate, during the week, always a day or two on dissertations. I mean, I know, and there will be peaks where you can do much more on dissertations, but you can't leave everything till Easter. It's just not going to happen. So, keep it ticking. For those of you who manage to connect something with the research methods, great. For those of you who manage to connect something with your atelier, it's fantastic. That's great. But you need to kind of see if you can make it tick as you do the other things. Anything else? Right. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. I'll put everything up on Moodle, and hopefully I can also put the recordings, not just the link, but the recording up. Take care, guys. Stay safe. Bye.